My name is Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to what 1989 can tell us about 2011. And we're very grateful to the co-sponsors of our event today, the African Studies Center, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the International Institute, and the International Policy Center. And our event today is really designed to draw lessons from the collapse of communism in East Central Europe and then the Soviet Union back in 1989-91. And to see what similarities and differences might inform our understanding of the remarkable uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa today. And I think here 3 points, very briefly, are worth keeping in mind. First, both in 1989 and today, what we see is popular mobilization against repressive and incompetent governments. These aren't simply just elite coups, but very much popular uprisings based on a popular desire for legitimate and competent governments that are responsive to, rather than oppressive of, their people. Second, a major difference between the two episodes, I think, is that the communist regimes all shared a common point of vulnerability, and that was the Communist Party system and its backing by the Soviet Union. In contrast, in the Middle East and in North Africa, we see very distinct resource endowments and structures of authority, and the bases of power and stability differ a great deal. So we're not very unlikely to see the kind of dominoes that we saw back in '89. And I think, third, we also should keep in mind that despite the similar points of origin, what we see in the former communist world is a huge diversity of outcomes. It wasn't all democracy. So we see democratic transformation in some cases, but in others, very violent civil wars and a return of autocratic regimes, especially the further east one goes. So in short, these two regional revolutions hold multiple points for comparison. And to do that, today we've assembled a group of experts on both the regions and on the conditions that produce revolutions. So let me introduce these superb analysts in the order in which they will speak. First, we'll have Scott Page, who is the Leonid Hurwitz Collegiate Professor of Complex Systems, Political Science, and Economics, and the director of the Center for the Study of Complex Systems. He's a leading theorist and analyst of diversity and an expert on complexity, basically on how simple rules and context can give rise to unexpected collective behavior, ranging from standing ovations to urban flight to regional revolutions. Next, we have Michael Dobbs, who's been a reporter for the Washington Post since 1980. He was the Post bureau chief in Eastern Europe, Paris, and Moscow, and he has covered the collapse of communism extensively. He was the first Western journalist to visit the Gdańsk shipyard in August of 1980, which is really sort of the event that triggered it all, and also covered the Tiananmen Square uprising in China and the abortive coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991. And he's also reported on the wars in former Yugoslavia. Next is Jan Schwener, who's the Everett E. Berg Professor of Business Administration and the director of the International Policy Center and Professor of Economics and Public Policy. Jan is the founding director of the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education in Prague, which is the premier institution for economic research in East Central Europe. And he has wide-ranging expertise both as an analyst of the economics of the transition and a consultant to numerous governments, international financial institutions, and firms. Next is Andrew Shryock, who is the Arthur Thurnau Professor of Anthropology, a leading cultural anthropologist, and an expert on Yemen and Jordan. His research in the Arab world centers on matters of historicity, nationalism, the oral tradition, tribe-state relations, and modernity. And he has also worked extensively on the question of Arab communities in the Detroit area and the complex issues of identity, nationalism, and culture. And finally, we have Juan Cole, who is the Robert P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History, an expert on the Middle East. He has published extensively with multiple books and dozens of book chapters and articles. He's a frequent guest on the United States and UK media news programs, and his award-winning blog, Informed Consent, is one of the most widely consulted and reliable sources of information and analysis on the Middle East. So with that, please join me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. As Anna mentioned, I direct this university Center for the Study of Complex Systems, so I don't study really revolutions or the Middle East or Eastern Europe. But what I was asked to do is give sort of a 5 or 10 minute framing on how to think about these theoretically. And one of the big puzzles about both the revolutions of 1989 and the most recent revolutions is really nobody predicted them. I mean, absolutely no one. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's the case. So even though we see, these are fairly large political events, right? And yet you'd think that political scientists could understand why they happened, yet we don't. So to think about this, I want to think about really 3 stages. So one is just asking, are the conditions right for there to be some sort of fire? right? And in all these cases, right, there's a lot of wood sitting in the oven, but there's a question of sort of where it's going to break out. And in some sense, you're predicting where a lightning strike is going to be if you want to ask, right, where the first flames of passion are going to rise up. And there's also the third question is, after these things happen, what are things going to look like? Now, typically what you see is what we call a smile curve in economics, where things initially get worse and then they get better. The reason they get worse, right, is it's a transition, and the reason they get better is you're usually taking countries that were left out of the global economy and you're putting them in the global economy, so things get better. This is Chuck DeVoe, and he's important because, for two reasons. One, he's being sued by Don Henley for using the song All She Wants to Do Is Dance in his campaign against Carly Fiorina. He's also the only person in North America correctly predict that Egypt was going to have a political uprising, right? Now, either he's a genius or there just happens to be. Also, we're two people that predict the Final Four of the NCAA tournament out of 6 million as well. So only one got this right, two got the NCAA tournament right, which gives you a sense of why it's hard to predict. What I think is interesting to me theoretically about this is, why is it hard to predict? So this is Ray Fair, who's at Yale, and he predicts sort of another macro level thing, which is, will there be a transition in the United States economy from the incumbent party, right, to the challenging party? And what he does is he runs these regressions, where on the bottom you're seeing the change in economic growth, and on the right-hand, on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you're seeing sort of how many votes the incumbent party gets. And what you see here is an R-squared of about 38%, and it's reasonably predictable. This is something we can understand. But we can't understand these revolutions, and the question is why. And there's really sort of four reasons. One is what I'm going to call percolation phenomena, that this is going to be sort of a classic tipping point. The second one is going to be something I call the tail wagging the dog. We do a lot of social science on means, so that fair stuff is done on means. When we look at something like uprisings, we're going to see that the tail of the distribution actually matters more than the mean does. The third is we'll see that location matters. It's going to matter sort of where people are spread out and who's connected to whom. And then the last thing is we're going to see that expectations matter a great deal. So just really quickly, when we think about classifying phenomena, social phenomena, we can think of linear phenomena, where the more I get of the x variable, the more I get of the y variable. So you think the more discontent, the more likely revolution. But if you construct models, things like revolutions, what you see is that they tend to have more like threshold phenomena. So what happens is that a lot can happen. You can get sort of more and more unrest and nothing happens, and you get a little more unrest and suddenly things flare up. Now the reason for this is because this is what we call sort of a social contagion thing. So if you look at time step one, look at this person in the green right here. He looks around him and he sees all these blues, and then maybe he switches his color to blue, but then this blue person over here switches his color to green. So what we see is there's two things that happen in groups of people. One is they moderate their behavior to match the behavior of those around them. The other thing they do is they move, right, to sort of be with other people who are like them. So if you look at little things, even like this is one of my favorite maps. This is the maps, the percentage of children who have ADHD, right? So when you move from Wyoming to Nebraska, the rate jumps from like 3% to 7%. I don't know if it's because there's no mountains or what, but so this could be because people have moved, to Colorado because of the fact that they basically, don't have ADHD, but it also could be the fact that other people are saying their kids need drugs, and so they're giving their friends' kids are taking drugs. So these things are very hard to unpack empirically, whether it's people moving to be with their, people like them, or whether they're changing their behavior. But in either case, what you end up getting is you get these percolation phenomena. And so this is a simple map. Imagine this being a whole set of people. And the people who are colored in are people who are willing to riot. And the people who are not colored in are people not willing to riot. And what we want to ask is, what's the probability of this thing sort of flaring up as a function of the percentage of people, right, who are upset? And so what you can do, I hope, is, oh, there we go. So here's a simple model of that. Here's the corporate advertisement for Net Logo from Northwestern University. Here we go. So I'm going to set this up. There's 58% of, let's move it down a little bit so it works for sure. So right now, 57% of the people are green, so they're sort of ready to riot. And if I set this thing up and have a little rebellion on the left, right, it spreads a little bit. I'll do it again at 57%. It spreads a little bit, but it tends to die off. If I move it down to like 55% and set it up and let it go, right, it dies off really quickly. But if I move it to, let's say, 62% and let this thing run, then you get the whole thing's going to take off. So if I graph this, remember the one I showed where it was a linear model and then it was sort of flat and went up? If I graph this, right, I end up getting, I hope, exactly this picture, that nothing happens up to about 56%, right? and then it just slowly starts to take off, and then you get these giant conflagrations. That's why it's incredibly hard to predict, because you can start saying, well, there's a lot of wood on the fire. There's people are, the Central Party's treating us badly, economic conditions are bad, there's no economic opportunity. But the thing is, it's only when you get to the threshold where things start to matter. Okay, here's the that's hard to predict. The tail really wags the dog. So there's a famous model by Mark Grenovetter where he basically says the following: suppose each person has a willingness to riot. We'll call this the WTR. That's how many people have to be rioting before you're rioting. So when I teach this to my undergraduates, I basically say, suppose you're in the mall, how many people have to start, robbing the Apple store before you rob the Apple store, right? Is that 2? Is that 20? Right? Whatever. So imagine case one, things look bad, right? Everybody's upset, but there's a willingness to riot, and it's totally homogeneous. Everybody's is 20. What does that mean? That means just a million people walking around mad as hell, but nothing happens, right? Because everybody's threshold's 20. Alternatively, suppose that now I've got a really high mean. People aren't that upset, but there's really high variance. So now I'm going to number the people from 0 to 10 million. So there's a person 0, a person 1, a person 2, a person 3, and so on. And I'm going to say the person's willingness to riot is their number divided by 2. So person 0's number is 0, person's 1 number is a half, person 2 number is 1, and so on. Well, here the average willingness to riot is 2.5 million. People aren't that upset, but what's going to happen is you're going to get a domino effect, right? One person riots, and then everybody else's riots. So this is the other reason these things are incredibly hard to predict. It doesn't matter really on average how upset people are, right? It matters what the mean is. Then quick sort of last point is that, as Anna mentioned, I've done a lot of work on standing ovations. I like to focus on really important social problems. So if you think of a standing ovation, this is a good metaphor to think about in some sense, people sort of, standing up, taking a stand in something, incurring some sort of personal cost. Think of the stage being in front. People can only see, one of the things we think about is, how much do people know? And people will talk about this a lot with sort of using Twitter and new technologies to know what's going on. In a standing ovation, people can only see the front. So there's celebrities we can think of. These are people who are right near the stage who they don't know much of anything because they don't know how many other people are standing up. But when they stand up, everybody can see them. So they have large social influence, but not much information. So the more celebrities you have, the more likely you are to get a riot when you shouldn't get one, right? And maybe not get a riot when you should get one. Now there's people in the back, and these are people like us. These are the academics. They can see everything, but nobody looks at them, right? So what's interesting is there's been some work recently in controlled experiments, not with riots, but with just music, asking how much does social influence affect what outcomes we get? So Matt Segalnik, who was here a couple weeks ago giving a talk, did this thing where they gave students access to free music, and they could rate the music, right, from sort of 1 to 10. And they had another group of students who could then download the music that had already been rated, and they could sort of see what other people were downloading. And what they found was that you can manipulate this thing. So here's a case where song 1, this black line you're seeing, is how many people sort of downloaded that song over time when people are getting given true information. Here's song 48. So song 1 is good, song 48 is awful. But then what they did is they manipulated the first 750 people, and they just sort of lied about what those people were saying, right? So these people were saying song 48 sucks and song 1 is good, right? But they lied about it for the first 752 people. And what you see is song 48 still takes off, and song 1 doesn't. So what they find in the context of music is behaviors between 25 and 65% social. That's a fairly large range, right? It's hard to get good data on this for willingness to riot. Let me just end with this. One thing that makes this very hard to get is willingness to riot. It does depend on dissatisfaction, but it also depends on expectations, right? Because these aren't just decisions to download music or stand up in a theater, right? They're decisions to possibly die. And so it's going to depend on how many other people are standing up, what you think the response is by others, right? So if you basically say, look, we're not going to shoot protesters, you're really increasing the likelihood that you're going to get in trouble, that you're going to have a big riot. And if you're Gaddafi and you say, I am going to shoot protesters, that's probably going to lower people's expectations about how many people are going to riot. And also sort of the probability of success. Now, last comment is this country-to-country contagion you could think of as just the same model, one level up, right? So now instead of just individual people rioting, you've got the countries rioting, right? And so then you can ask, well, can we predict whether we're going to get sort of, a whole bunch of countries all rioting at the same time? Well, that becomes probably as hard to predict as you could within one country, right? Because that's just the same problem translated. One last thing, I'll just point this out with people talk a lot about the Twitter stuff, and I think people will talk about this. Al Jazeera has a site that you can go to which looks at sort of, it's monitoring at each instant in time, how many people are Twittering, how many came in the last minute, and that sort of stuff. These Twitters may lower willingness to riot, right? Because they may make people sort of, more willing to go. And they certainly help in coordination. But the other thing that's funny about this is that they do also lower the variation, what people know, right? One of the things we see is that variation could be one reason why these things take off. So it's not, I'm not convinced, one way or the other necessarily about what the direct effect of Twitter is on this stuff. All right, thank you.
Okay, so I had the great privilege of covering a lot of these revolutions against communism, beginning with the Polish Solidarity Revolution in 1980. By 1989, actually, I'd moved to Moscow as the bureau chief for the Washington Post. So I saw what happened from Moscow. And so I've got a kind of Russian take to begin with. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday that you may have seen about, I think it was headlined, "Every Revolution is Revolutionary in Its Own Way." Of course, referring to Tolstoy. But I'd like to tweak that a little bit in a way that I think is truer to the opening lines of Anna Karenina. In their happy phase, revolutions are all alike. But in their unhappy phase, each revolution is unhappy in its own way. So what do I mean by that? Well, the happy phase of a revolution is the time, we've seen this over the last 2 months in the Middle East, in one city after another. Jubilant masses of people coming out onto the streets, a sense of incredible possibilities, euphoria. The weather, the sun always seems to be shining even when it isn't. It's summed up, in the words of Wordsworth about the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And I certainly experienced a lot of that euphoria in Eastern Europe. What do I mean by the unhappy phase? The before and after of revolutions. I mean, each of these countries is unhappy in its own way. They've all suffered from some kind of tyrannical rule, corruption, oppression, but the causes are all different. In each of the Arab countries, the ethnic makeup is different. In the Eastern European countries, the historical traditions were different. And how revolutions end is also differs. And one common theme is that I think, we've seen again and again that if a government is willing to use force against the people, then bullets will trump Twitter messages, any amount of Twitter messages. Or in the case of Tiananmen in 1989, any amount of fax machines, which was the information technology that was the revolutionary information technology of the time. I've been interested, while I've been here at Michigan, on the reliance on information, the role of information technologies. That's what I've been teaching courses about. Back in 1989, of course, there was no internet. The information technology was, as I said, the fax machine, also satellite dishes, leaflets, of course, and in some ways they were just as effective as Twitter machine, as Twitter has been, as social media has been in the present day revolutions. I'm sorry, Can I speak at the end, actually? I'm not feeling very well.
Take over. So I'll speak partially from what I've been studying and partially from experience. I know obviously much more about Central Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States than about the Middle East, North Africa, but I'll try my best to sort of link it. I think one thing that really struck me and many observers is how fragile the communist system in the end was. And in some sense, you know, it's the surprise element that we heard about earlier. We see it in the Middle East as well. I mean, nobody really was predicting it. I mean, there were always predictions, right? People are predicting the fall of the Soviet Union from the moment it appeared, but that was not very useful. It lasted decades thereafter. So the question is, can you not be the random element that predicts at the right time, but can you systematically be able to predict? And I think the unexpected implosion, and really implosion of the Soviet-style system, was just an amazing thing. And an interesting thing will be to what extent we'll see a real implosion as we go on in the Middle East and Maghreb further. So this was sort of interesting at the beginning. It looks like a monolithic type setup with a lot of tensions, of course, and problems and so on, but then suddenly it kind of disappears. The second element that's interesting is that in both situations there's been, at the beginning, a broad base of initial support. So you have people from all walks of life. It may relate to the percentage support that you get for a given activity. And I think in both cases there is a very significant base of initial support. And that is both good but also dangerous, because in the dynamics of revolutions, as was mentioned, the expectations play an incredibly important part, and they did in both, they do in both situations. So in '89, the expectations were very, very high. And in fact, the U-shaped type outcome, the smile outcome that we saw here in the picture, was not expected at all. Because after all, you were replacing an inferior system by a superior system. So everybody expected the rise in living standards and everything to be very quick and very beneficial. And in fact, the outcomes have been very varied, and very few of the countries really went smoothly up, as opposed to going down first a lot. I mean, these recessions, if we look at it in economic terms in Central Eastern Europe, were at the same level or greater than the Great Depression that the West went through in the 1930s. Totally unexpected. So I think that's important, and the thing that went with it is that basically in virtually all the countries except the Czech Republic, you had an almost immediate ouster of the revolutionary leaders. The first generation of democratically elected politicians in Central Eastern Europe were quickly replaced by the former communists because things were really bad. So you have to realize that the initial positive outcome may not last too long. Then there were a number of important misconceptions. Everybody at the beginning thought that certain policies would work and deliver good outcomes. And as it turns out, with the hindsight of 20 years, we realized that it has not been the case. So something to watch out for in the current events as well. The best example, I think, in the former Soviet bloc countries is privatization. Everybody expected that if you privatize, things will get better. Turns out from the data we're getting now, if you privatize to foreign owners, things got better. Those companies tend to run quite well. But privatization to domestic private owners was very mixed type results, and in fact very often pretty bad in terms of tunneling, defrauding, and asset stripping, and so on and so forth. So not all policies that look like a good remedy to sort of follow the immediate revolutionary spirit work. So that's, I think, important. I would say, in retrospect, what seems to be very important, and it'll be interesting to see if people think that's the same thing that's important in the current context, but in the former Soviet bloc context, the development of a really good functioning legal and institutional framework, I think, was, in the end, the most important aspect, and one that was often not carried out. And it had happened to be the Achilles heel of everything in terms of how these economies function or not function, the extent to which we see corruption and fraudulent type behavior. So I think that's interesting. And finally, I think very important, and people obviously are asking this question of themselves now already, is what's going to be, or what is the appropriate role of external actors, countries, other countries, the West, non-government institutions, organizations, and so on and so forth, in order to facilitate the transition to the best possible social outcome that one can imagine. And I think here what is interesting is from, if one compares the countries in Central Eastern Europe and the countries further east, is that the role that the entry into the European Union played was very beneficial. In other words, what you see is that these countries avoided a number of problems, that they actually worked hard in order to reach that goal. And so to put it sort of analytically, what mattered not only were initial conditions that we normally focus on, but what mattered were the terminal conditions. Okay, that you get into the European Union or later into the Eurozone or something like that, that really determined to a large extent how these countries succeeded or didn't succeed. And the CIS countries, by and large, did not aspire and were not invited to become members of this club. And really, elsewhere in the world, we don't have very good examples of that. Mexico, when joining NAFTA, might be sort of in the economic sense an example of it. But most countries don't have something to aspire to join the way some of the former Soviet bloc countries could join the European Union or the Eurozone. So that suggests that although it may not be the entry into the European Union or something like that, but having some kind of goal and legitimate target to strive for with a sort of well-defined benefit at the end might actually improve the chances that the countries that are currently going through a lot of turmoil and revolutionary fervor might result or achieve some relatively positive outcome as opposed to a outcome that will be negative from many respects. So let me stop here. Thanks.
When I was invited to speak on this panel over a month ago, I warily accepted, thinking, a month from now, I'll understand what's going on. It's hard to make sense of things when you're caught in the middle of a revolutionary cascade. My preparatory month has come and gone, and my gamble did not pay off. I'm still not sure I can make sense of this revolutionary moment, or make predictions, or plot trajectories. To members of the audience who expect that kind of sage performance, I apologize. But I must admit, I expect that kind of sage performance. Luckily, I have my own go-to sage in Jordan, a political activist I've worked with since I did my first research there over 20 years ago. Dr. Ahmed Awadi al-Abbadi is a former member of the Jordanian lower house of parliament. He began his career as a public security officer. Then he became a writer of popular television serials, then a folklorist and anthropologist of Jordanian tribal society. He's now a leader of an unrecognized political opposition party called the Jordan National Movement. He recently spent 2 years in prison for sending a letter to the U.S. Senate criticizing corruption in Jordan and posting that letter on the web. Dr. Ahmed is a firebrand, highly controversial in Jordan. His views are located toward the right-wing populist edge of the political spectrum. He identifies proudly as a Jordanian, a son of the tribes, but he is also a harsh critic of the government. His profile is not uncommon in the Jordanian tribal sector, which is not exactly the constituency of knee-jerk support for the Hashemites it's portrayed to be in the West. Dr. Ahmed is a confident man with a prophetic sensibility, and he immediately saw the Arab uprisings as a chance to make radical changes in his own society. Back in February, he wrote a letter signed by 36 tribal leaders, which excoriated the Jordanian government for its endless corruption, stalled democratization drives, arrogant disregard of the people's desire for effective and lasting reform, and, borrowing a theme from Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, the letter gave special attention to the extravagant spending, nepotism, and political meddling of Queen Rania. In classic and mandatory Jordanian style, this blistering letter of critique was offered in heartfelt defense of the throne and in support of the king. May God watch over him and prolong his life. This grace note of support for the monarch is not just political theater. A distinctive feature of recent Jordanian protests, something that sets them apart from those in Egypt and Tunisia, is that most opposition groups fully support the Hashemite monarchy, at least in public. The popular chant heard around the world is, "The people demand the fall of the regime," But in Jordan, it's the people demand reform of the regime. Reform, not collapse. The regime in Jordan is not the monarchy itself, but the various governments and ministers the king appoints and disposes of as he sees fit. A problem for revolutionaries in Jordan is that King Abdullah II, in the manner he learned from his father Hussein, pretends to float above the political system as a kind of neutral arbiter, protecting the rights of all Jordanians, not against encroachment by him, the monarch, but against the dangers his Jordanian subjects present to each other. The Hashemites over the last 9 decades have crafted a polity in which their subjects are convinced that civil war and chaos would result if the restraining force of Hashemite rule were removed. Palestinians and East Bank tribesmen would fight each other to the death. Minority Christians, Circassians, and Chechens would be overwhelmed by the Arab Muslim majority. The business elite would have its wealth confiscated by populists. Secularists would be crushed underfoot by hardcore Islamists, and so on and on. Jordanians generally believe and fear this vision of a post-Hashemite era. What is more, almost every key constituency in Jordan believes the king supports some other constituency more. The recipe for divide and rule politics is firmly in place, and the Hashemites cook it up to perfection, all the while insisting on the absolute necessity of our national unity and threatening destruction to anyone who disturbs it. This is the climate in which Dr. Ahmed has lived his political life, which began, fittingly, in 1989. For Dr. Ahmed, this was not the year the Eastern Bloc collapsed. It was the year in which Jordanians rioted over rising gas and kerosene prices, and King Hussein decided to liberalize the political process. National parliamentary elections were held for the first time since 1967, and Dr. Ahmed won a seat. It was an exciting time in Jordan. People were told by the king that the road to democracy was open and there would be no turning back. This has been the message for over 20 years now, and most political observers agree that not much additional progress has been made. Democratization in Jordan is clearly a matter of regime survival. It is constantly promised, it is always inevitable, but it is incremental at best. Jordanian democracy has become sustainable monarchy. King Abdullah speaks the metropolitan idiom of liberalization better than any Arab leader, and he does so in perfect English. But as Hashemite monarch, he is not a symbolic head of state, like the lingering dynasts of Europe. He very much runs the show, and anyone who tries to alter his constitutional power to do so will be removed from the political process. Like many Jordanians, Dr. Ahmed finds this system overbearing, threatening, and at times humiliating. The government speaks to us as if we were children, he told me, but the people have changed. The leaders have not changed, but the people have changed, and we say enough of this old patriarchal model. It is no longer acceptable to pretend the leader is the father and we are his silent, respectful family. This conceptual shift is central to the Arab revolutions. Listen closely to the conversations between rulers and protesters. One speaks down as a parent to a child. The other talks back, saying, "You're not the boss of me. You don't respect me. You don't deserve my respect anymore." If these exchanges have a familial ring, if you've engaged in some of these exchanges yourselves, it's because political culture in Arab societies is modeled on house culture. And any demographer of the Middle East will tell you that the time is ripe, overripe in fact, for the younger generation to shake off the older. In Egypt, a country ruled by an octogenarian dictator, the scenario seemed literal. But in countries like Syria and Jordan, where the leader is young, the popular rejection of time-worn paternalist motifs is no less obvious. People want to be citizens, not subjects, not obedient children, or a well-tended herd of sheep. Dr. Ahmed told me during a recent email exchange that he had predicted all of this current chaos many years ago. He always likes to claim he predicted some recent event. When he was lecturing at Yarmouk University, the flood of chaos would be political, economic, and cultural. It would eventuate in the collapse of all existing Arab regimes, securing a shift to democracy and an anti-American tilt that will last, he says, 70 years. The current revolutionary moment, he argues, was made possible by improved access to media, by the realization that the U.S. and the West would not bring democracy to the Arab world, but had instead brought pillage, rape, and destruction, and by the people's exhaustion with the greed, intimidation, corruption, and treachery of their leaders. Everywhere in the Arab countries, he says, people have experienced the same pain, the same hopes and dreams. When they saw what was happening in Tunisia, they realized that their bare hands were stronger than American weapons, stronger than tanks, and they lost their fear. They took off their cloak of political modesty, he calls it, their shame in the face of power. The Arab world, Dr. Ahmed says, was like a field of dry wheat, saturated with gasoline. When the match was struck, the fire spread quickly. Now it can't be stopped. This explanation of recent events is based on a few simple ideas. The Arabs are a people united by shared experiences. Their regimes are all corrupt and have been since the colonial powers created them. I'm ventriloquizing Ahmed here, not my own views per se. The ability of the regimes to conceal this corruption has been diminished by the availability of new media and sources of information. And a generation is realizing its own strength, its ability to say no. The sense of freedom and elation that results is irresistible. It's telling that the words Arabs used to describe their feelings when observing the early revolts in Tunisia and Egypt were pride, joy, and envy. It made us jealous to watch this. From these sentiments comes the will to reproduce and imitate. The formula becomes format. The gatherings in public squares, the refusal to leave until demands are met, the violent response from the authorities, the pledge of change at an appropriate pace, the rejection of this offer, the crackdown or collapse, the uncertain aftermath. It would seem that Jordanians have been watching and learning. Last week, opposition groups tried to set up a Tahrir Square-style camp near the Ministry of the Interior in Amman. Several hundred pro-government demonstrators suddenly materialized. They threw rocks at the opposition and attacked them with sticks. Police intervened and broke up the camp. Hundreds were injured. One person died. The reform demonstrators clearly wanted to enact the Egyptian model. The security forces wanted to prevent it. Prime Minister Ma'ruf al-Bakhit told Jordanian TV viewers that the Islamic Brotherhood was behind the protests and that they were playing with fire. He offered not a word of criticism against the pro-regime thugs who had attacked what was clearly a peaceful gathering. I asked Dr. Ahmed if he had been at the protest. He said no. He wanted to stay out of the contest at this stage. There are several traditional Arab battlefield tactics, he said. One is the direct and sudden attack made with overwhelming force. This is the method preferred by the Bani Sakhr Bedouin who live in the open desert. So he's talking about his own local tribal groups. They live in the open desert without trees or rocks for cover. Second is the strategy of the bad tribes, he's an Abadi, which is to outlast your opponent, to tire him out and test his strength, then to attack when he's spent. The third strategy is that of the Adwan tribe, who used slave soldiers and weaker allies to fight for them, entering the fray only at the last minute to claim victory. The strategy of Dr. Ahmed and the Jordan National Movement, he told me, will be a clever mix of these strategies, and God willing, it will be successful. As I pondered this analysis, it occurred to me that Dr. Ahmed, despite his bravado, is still not sure what will happen next. He began to spin conspiracy theories to account for the security forces' violent intervention in a peaceful protest. Perhaps Rania is behind it, he speculated. Perhaps she wants to discredit the king and pave the way for her son, Hussein II, to assume the throne. This seemed far-fetched to me. When I asked him if people were ready for democracy or if they would reinvent the older authoritarian regime bit by bit, he was certain that the shift to democracy was real and permanent. People will not destroy their own accomplishments, he said, because they're controlled by natural patriotic impulses. They love their country and do not want to harm it. Arabs are used to being told they can't do things, that they're not ready for things other humans possess and enjoy. I wanted Dr. Ahmed to ponder the reality of cultural and political constraints, of U.S. hegemony, of unintended and unforeseen consequences. But he has little time for that now. His eyes are set on the future. Like thousands of political actors across the Arab world, he studies the battlefield, lines up his allies, and waits anxiously for stronger opponents to grow weak. Thank you.
And we're delighted that Khalid Matawa could join us right now. He's the Associate Professor of English Language and Literature and an award-winning poet and writer. Born in Benghazi, Libya, he emigrated to the United States in 1979 and completed degrees in economics and in political science, as well as a Master of Fine Arts. He's the author of 4 books of poetry, a translator of 9 books of contemporary Arabic poetry, and the editor of 2 anthologies.
My colleague has covered some of the areas I wanted to cover about the comparison, and of course the wonderful presentation on the dynamics of revolution. But we've seen, as in the Velvet Revolution, student demonstrations happens and then gets repeated the next day, and then the government breaks down. In that sense, maybe Tunisia and Egypt probably looked and sounded more like the revolutions in Europe, which again would bring me to the idea that maybe the revolutions in Europe, as my other colleagues were saying, were actually not the typical revolutions that we think of, because they had a better plan in the coming. But some elements that were available in Egypt and Eastern Europe are not, and I'm thinking from Libya, were not available in Libya. The ability to organize was somewhat available under the Eastern European countries. There were other parties existed, Charter 77 and so on. So alternative political entities, the syndicate that Lech Wałęsa had worked under, the Peasant Party in Poland. There were other bodies working. And in Egypt, you had other political parties. The Ikhwan at some point were in the parliament, and there were leftist parties also had operated. In Tunisia, the union of Ittihad al-Shughal, or the union of labor union in Egypt was important. The protest in Mahalla and Mansoura were central to the Cairo protest, and in Mahalla there had been labor protests in Egypt before. I mean, not just this revolution, several times before. Several were killed in riots there. So you had some syndicates working as well. I think 2 factors that had worked perhaps in the earlier revolutions that in the European revolutions that were not the same. One is you had some political rootedness was important, perhaps in somebody like Wałęsa or Václav Havel, and some foundational elements. Some centrality in Poland particularly. So centrality, solidity were important, while in these revolutions what was important was fluidity, anonymity, and decentralization. It wasn't like standing firm, but rather being very quick is what made the Egyptian revolution and the Tunisian one take place. That you were anonymous was important rather than being known. So, and that's what the internet elements were important for. The external factor, of course, was what my colleague talked about. I mean, Eastern Europe was more like a colonized territory dominated by Soviet Russia. The communist regimes of Eastern Europe depended on the existence of Soviet troops in their countries. The Soviets were able to suppress Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 because they could run the tanks into Budapest and Prague. They couldn't do that in 1989. So Eastern Europe were ready to part ways from Soviet Russia, and the signs were there. And dismantled party. I mean, in Czechoslovakia, it was actually the head of the Communist Party that said, okay, we're not going to be a one-party state anymore. We will switch. And so, and that's precisely because the Soviets couldn't stop him, in essence. In Arab revolutions, so in a sense, the European revolutions were perhaps more of a single revolution because it was really the crumbling of the of the police system that was the Soviet system. And so in the Arab Revolution, we're having sort of more. And at some point, it seemed like the Tunisians happened, and who's going to go next? Well, the Egyptians came to the plate. And then after Egypt, who's going to be next? After Egypt, several had come in. And it's sort of this, you first issue. It seemed, though, but we were having different, I think, revolutions. I could say maybe Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and Syria are kind of the same, and Egypt, Yemen, and Syria, partly because of the existence of oppositional parties. The opposition still plays an important role in Yemen, in sort of being an in-between, sometimes pushing towards Saleh, sometimes not, so on. In Libya, really, these don't, the external factors in none of the Arab countries is really, well, in Libya it's playing an important role, but for some time the French were ready to send special troops to support Ben Ali. It was not American action, but rather sort of American inaction that sort of let the chips fall where they may in Egypt. So the foreign position, or the Western position on Mubarak, was kind of wobbly. Really, the Americans didn't know what they were doing, neither were the Europeans. The Arab Revolution depended on the implosions of their regimes and not the breaking up of a colonizing occupation external force. Now, how and why these internal implosions took place? First, you had the army and you had the security sources. Early on, the Tunisian army was marginalized, and the Egyptian army had already sort of taken on its own position. What had happened is that there was a formal outsourcing of security both in Egypt and Tunisia. And these crumbling bodies broke down. In Libya, where the revolt succeeded, in some parts of Libya, it was because of these security networks also fell apart, like in Tunisia and Egypt. Where it didn't, were these security parts held in part. Now, in all three regimes, though, one can say that the tension was between the middle class, who is not dependent on governmental subsidies, jobs and patronage, or had given up on them, and those who were dependent on them. As opposed to the security forces, the Egyptian and Tunisian segments of and the Libyan army that are largely middle class, inclusive, especially the Egyptian one. In essence, the army in Egypt could not remain deaf to the rest of the class to which it belonged, which had become increasingly intolerant of Mubarak and his apparatus. The same with Ben Ali, and and Mubarak's group was basically rich people who have an internal security system, rich people making money through terrible privatizations that had sucked all these sort of high-level employment government agencies. They had been given over cheaply to Mubarak's folks. And and these people didn't need the army. They had their own internal security units. And these internal security units were based on semi-criminal and ex-criminal units that had been given the freedom to run Egypt's drug trade and the task of beating up dissidents. So basically, you protect us, but you do whatever you want. You engage in whatever crime you want, and we privatize these on. In Libya, the struggle also was between the middle class, including segments of the army in the east, not the battalions run by Gaddafi's sons, which are separate army in themselves. And these battalions, as you may have heard by now, they're naturalized Africans from the Sahel, recently brought mercenaries, and several people who are in pay. So people who are in pay to Gaddafi, whether they're Libyan or not, are stuck with him. The people who did not depend on Gaddafi at all were the ones who revolted. And so the battalions run by Gaddafi's sons, which was a separate army. All forms of economic support had been taken away from the middle class or the potential middle class. By that I mean the educated who had been left to their own devices in the economic changes that took place in Libya in the last decade, whereby the state Gaddafi regime was raking in oil money and where inflation grew higher, and where small segments became visibly rich, while food subsidies, which is what the middle class had lived on, had been lifted. In Libya and Tripoli, where there's a huge housing shortage, where everything was becoming very expensive. The meter of land in Tripoli had become $2,500 for a meter of land in Tripoli. You could buy a piece of land for your villa, which costed $2 million. And clearly only a few people could afford this. So inflation had gone nuts, and still there were people buying. And people knew this. There were people who were able to buy villas for $10 million, and there were people who had nothing. So the situation is a middle class revolution, a lower middle class revolution, anonymous and mobile. Now, what are the worries that we are concerned about? Political vacuum. The European revolutions, while they may have been unexpected, they have 25 years of support behind them, in the same way that the anti-Soviet dissidents had somewhere to go, whether they were through exile or Nobel Peace Prizes. Their countries had the Arab countries had nowhere to go, really. The European countries had better economies to look forward to, and Western Europe had been eagerly awaiting their integration into the economic system. The middle revolutions really have nowhere to go regionally. Neither the US nor Europe longed for them or helped support them particularly. The American disengagement was crucial and may have served in Egypt at least to keep that country in America's sphere of influence, given that the Egyptian American-trained army wishes for its status quo to remain the same. And so the army is operating Egypt now on the basis that it's on a long-term relationship with America, but these revolutions, it's not clear where they may go. We do have a vacuum. Does this mean radicalism is inevitable? Revolutions become more revolutionary. The first people that take the lead are closer to the old regime. That's happened in all of them. Then the circles widen to include people from further afield. We saw this pattern in both the European revolution in Egypt and Tunisia, and very likely Yemen. But the European revolutions are not really typical ones. Looking earlier at models, whether it is the Iranian, Russian, or French revolutions, they've not always led to democracy, rather the opposite. What we may fear and contemplate is a reign of terror in all the revolutions happening in the Middle East and Africa. Will the lack of charismatic leadership among the revolutionaries now lead to such a demand, allowing for the rise of such figures and institutions? It remains unknown. But again, the factor of fluidity, rootlessness, anonymity may work against the solidifying of leadership. The revolutionaries are, what I mean is the revolutions are likely to continue. And the two factors that are, I think, at play here. One, the notion of enough, it's enough, you've ruled the country for 40 years, for 50 years, get out, all of this notion. The idea of a leader not destined to lead for the rest of his life. I mean, I don't know how many times that has actually been said in Islamic society, where the Khalifa stays on, the whole idea of ruling for life has become contrary to the culture. And so that's very important. The notion of a single leader taking over and leading the country is not palatable. Furthermore, I think this is probably we saw the Sunni reaction to the Iraq invasion, and also the Shiite reaction. In many ways, the Shiite reaction, there was always the imamate figure coming to lead. The Sunnis had always been never really rallied against a single figure. And in a sense, the idea of some strong figure, religious figure, leading the country, whether he's religious or not, within the Sunni context is not likely to stand. What is the role of religion? The unknown force in all these revolutions is, of course, Islam. None of the Middle East revolutions, however, is Islamist. The causes behind all of them is rampant corruption among the ruling elites and economic hardship among the middle class and lower middle classes, who are educated enough to be ambitious but have not been given the means to pursue their ambitions. The revolutions did not rise to establish an Islamic state, but Islam as a religion has provided a moral prism from which to view the economic corruptions of all three regimes, mainly in the areas of social injustice and the kleptocracies that ran all 3 or 4 countries in North Africa and elsewhere. It should be noted that among the first revolutions in Islamic history was one such revolution against a kleptocracy, mainly the revolution against the Caliph Uthman, whose rule was seen as the kleptocracy whereby his bloodkin, the Umayyad in Mecca, assumed important roles and positions and enriched themselves considerably under his rule. Uthman's blood-soaked shirt is an important symbol of revolt. So while Gaddafi, who never really trusted fatwas, was sending these fatwas, Saudi fatwas, saying you cannot rebel against the Wali al-Amr or the leader, there is also an Islamic tradition of no, you have to kill Uthman, even though he's Muhammad's father-in-law, if he gives the riches of the country to. So basically, we have Islam is in itself fluid as to what do you deal with the leadership in Islam. Well, in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, will they become Islamic states? Yes and no. Already talk in these streets of Egypt is Ikhwan-led government that is at peace with the army is perhaps plausible. But in Tunisia and in Tunisia, the Nahda parties called for lifting the ban on the wearing of the hijab, and the opening of mosques is gaining much support on the street. Al-Nahda, before it was banned, simply asked for making Friday the weekly holiday instead of Sunday, which had not happened. I mean, Bourguiba would not allow it, and Ben Ali would not. In essence, the Islamist elements will exert some influence on both countries. How these developments affect the situation of women and minorities in both countries, how will these calling for secular democracies be treated? These questions remain to be answered. In Libya and even in Yemen, I can't tell what external influence the Islamists will have both. Both of these societies are already conservative. Elements of the Sharia are already applied in civic law. And at least in Libya, Al-Qaeda never really had a strong presence in Libya. Will an Islamist win in all or any of these countries mean the suppression of divergent points of view? Perhaps. But also, there is selectivity among religion, rejection of the fatwas that I mentioned, and rejection of the idea of a single leader who shall remain forever. These notions are gone. My answer to what will happen will go back to the roots of these revolutions, which remains the suppression of an ambitious, educated middle class whose well-being and economic development has no solutions that can be based on religion or tribalism. Whoever is to rule will have to deliver some economic developments and opportunities for the region. If the Islamists don't have a solution, it's very difficult for them to continue. In this case, however, Libya may fare better. Its oil and small population may allow it to continue as a welfare state with large entitlements expenditure. Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen especially cannot afford to do this. Whoever rules these countries will have to address the needs of the people and will have to continuously do so. After all, Islam allows you, and the revolutions will continue, whether on an Islamic basis or not. You are allowed to revolt against an Islamic ruler. Will these revolutions end? Yemen, perhaps not. Because it is so poor. Egypt will go on for some time. The revolutionaries, the secularists perhaps, and other forces will go on because the army wants to settle things and people are not ready to let them. Tunisia may fare best. Bahrain, I think they've lost because Saudi Arabia is with them. And Libya now sounds a lot like 1951, where the world needed to help cobble that country together. Back then it was in the UN halls, and it was between the leftover armies of England and the US and France. Back in 1951 they were there, and now they're there again, sort of, and the Libyans have to sort their country together. I'm from Libya, and I'm actually quite hopeful, and I'm cheering every time Gaddafi's forces get a lick. Thanks.
Well, we've heard a lot of rich observations today, and let me just make a few additions before we open it up to a discussion. I do think that the question of the posture of the military is quite important in these popular revolts. Although it's the fact that the Eastern European revolutions were much aided by the knowledge that the Soviets were no longer going to roll tanks. and that may have given some people some courage. It was also necessary for the Polish military and the Czechoslovakian military and so forth to decline to roll tanks because they had their own. I think that when you took away the external support, the issue is pitched differently because the military has to decide whether it will fire on its own people. Now, in Tunisia and Egypt, it was made clear to the dictators fairly early on in the demonstrations that the military simply was not going to do that. In Tunisia, the military is small, and the officer corps, I think, really worried about the institution were it to get involved in attempting to repress so many people, because there were, I mean, Tunisia is not a large country, it's about 10.5 million people, and there were literally hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of the capital by then, and then there were large crowds all throughout the rural towns. In Egypt, you have a military of about 450,000, but something on the order of 380,000 of that were conscripts, and the young men are brought in for 3 years and so forth. Well, that ordering those conscripts to fire on the crowds in Tahrir Square would mean they'd be firing on their cousins, on their classmates from 2 years ago when they were in high school and so forth, and you couldn't trust them to do that on a large scale and consistently. And I think that's one of the reasons, the fact that Egypt had a conscript army, that the General Sami Anan, who was the head of the army, went on television, I think without asking anybody's permission, and simply said, this was the Monday after the revolt began. The revolt began on January 25th, which was a Tuesday. The following Monday, Sami Anan went on television. He was on Al Jazeera, he was on the Nilesat channels, and he said, the Egyptian army will never fire on the Egyptian people. It is the guardian of the Egyptian nation. And I said to myself, well, Mubarak is over with. So the fact that these militaries wouldn't intervene is not completely unconnected to external forces. My suspicion is, and we won't know this until somebody else leaks cables, or until they're declassified, but my suspicion is that the U.S. Pentagon told Sami Anan not to fire on the crowds. And since the United States gives Egypt nearly $1 billion a year in military aid, a lot of Egyptian officers have been trained in Fort Bragg with very close networks between the Egyptian military and the American military. It's not like the Soviet-Polish relationship, but it's also not completely different. So I suspect that at some points in some of these places, the Pentagon officer corps is really proud of obeying civilians as a principle, and it proselytizes this to the other militaries that it has a lot to do with. And I know, it's easy to be cynical about these kinds of values if you're a civilian and you're outside of it, but they really believe in this, and they're proud of the way in which they've tried to tell their colleagues in places like Egypt that this is what a military is about. A professional military man takes his orders from civilian politicians. So I think that the Americans may have played a role in easing the transition in Egypt and avoiding the Libya kind of situation. And of course, in Libya's case, there wasn't an obvious external backer of that military, and it wasn't a conscript military. The Khamis Brigade and those things were quite specialized and very much tied to the Gaddafi family. And so its ability and willingness to intervene were quite distinct from that in Egypt and Tunisia. Likewise, in Bahrain, there's a small island of about, at most 600,000 citizens. So it's like Ann Arbor, Canton, and Plymouth, of which about 2/3 are Shiite Muslims and 1/3 are Sunni Muslims. Then in addition to that, there are 600,000 guest workers, a lot of them Indian and Pakistani Muslims, but also Hindus and Christians. And the king is Sunni, so he has engaged in widespread discrimination in favor of Sunnis. You want a government job, you want a ministerial job, you want a government contract or license, good to be a Sunni. And even sometimes a Pakistani Sunni would be favored over a Bahraini Shiite. And so this is kind of Arizona on steroids. It really is about labor issues, job access, and then what the Shiites would see as federal government preference for immigrant labor. So the Shiites came out into the streets and were making a push, initially I think mainly for a betterment of their economic position, more access to government jobs, more access to private sector jobs, less preference for imported white collar and other labor. And however, they also did have constitutional demands. Bahrain is an absolute monarchy, more or less. It does have a constitution and a parliament, but they're kind of like, you know, a debating society. So the parliament has an upper house with 40 seats, which are appointed by the king. And then it has a lower house of 40 seats, and the elections for that are, the seats are elected but from districts, but the electoral districts have been gerrymandered to make sure that the Shiites don't get a majority in the lower house. So they've got 18 seats out of the 40, even though they're the 2/3 of the citizens. And anything the lower house decides can be overruled by the upper house, which was appointed by the king. And then the Constitution goes on to say that anything the upper house passes can be overruled by the king. So the Shiites feel that they don't really have any power in this system, and it's kind of a sham. And in fact, at the moment, all 18 of the members of parliament have resigned. This ethnic divide has impeded constitutional reform and democratization because they just can't bargain with each other. You know, whoever the crowds were in Tahrir Square in Cairo or in downtown Alexandria, they just weren't that different from the people at the top of the government. There wasn't a fear that some other group is going to get in and screw you over because they're going to bring all their cousins in and take all the goodies. But in Bahrain, the Sunni monarchy has already made it clear that it's in favor of giving the goodies to its cousins, and the prime minister, by the way, is the uncle of the king. And he's been the only prime minister since Bahrain became independent from Britain in 1971. Just one prime minister, and he's the uncle of the king. So it's clear what's going on here, and the basis for bargaining and sharing is just not there. And so ultimately the king became afraid of these crowds, which were getting bigger and bigger, and they were the indigenous majority citizen population, and he brought in the Wahhabi Saudi Arabia to put them down. He brought in Big Brother. You know, if you don't like Sunnis, you're really not going to like Wahhabis. And they just attacked the demonstrators in the Pearl Roundabout downtown Bahrain and dispersed them. And now people are very sullen, and Kuwait is offering to mediate, and the United States, in this situation, unlike the situation in Egypt, I think wasn't in a position to tell the Bahrain military to cool it. First of all, the U.S. Has its naval base at Bahrain in Manama. It's the headquarters of the 5th Fleet. The Bahrainis don't have to lease us that base. So we didn't have a lot on them. It was quite the other way around. And then the Saudis, you know, have upped their oil production to offset the loss of the Libyan. The world produces 85 million barrels a day of petroleum. The Saudis were doing 8.5. They've gone up to over 9. The Libyans did 1.7 million barrels a day. That's almost all off the market. and it's a tight world oil market. So the danger was with the Libyan revolts, and especially if they spread to any other oil countries, and they did spread to Oman, that in a tight market, even taking a couple million barrels off the market could cause a price spike. And of course, it has caused a price spike. West Texas crude has gone from $80 a barrel to $106. And although energy is only about 6% of GDP, energy inputs, affect the price of food and all the things we cart around and the clothing you're wearing and so forth. So there's some fear that if this petroleum crisis got bad enough, it would tip the world back into the kind of recession we saw, deep recession we saw in 2008, 2009, which would be very bad for the Obama presidency. So I think when it came to the Persian Gulf region, which is where 2/3 of the world's proven petroleum reserves are, and to making the Saudis happy and to keeping Bahrain stable and keeping the Fifth Fleet having a headquarters in the Persian Gulf region and being able to police the petroleum exports and so forth, the United States didn't take a horrible position. Its position was that the king should talk to the opposition and try to work things out. And that was said before the crackdown, and its Secretary of Defense Gates said it again on Sunday in a call to the king, said, why don't you try to work things out? But you'll note the difference between the posture in Libya and the posture in Bahrain. By the way, the Libyan intervention, I can't make work as an oil intervention. I can't. Gaddafi had already done a lot of contracts with the Western oil companies. Why would they want to throw them into doubt? I think it really is, in ways I can't entirely explain, a humanitarian intervention of sorts. I think it's like the Balkans in the sense that it was just shameful to have a massacre going on, on the fringes of Europe so many years after World War II, and they just weren't going to put up with it. And so I think that none of these Arab Spring revolts looks to me very much like Yugoslavia. Some of them look more like Romania than like Poland. And Khalid is perfectly right that I don't know if we can expect a good outcome everywhere. Possibly the most troubling of them is Yemen, which is a country that used to be two countries, was forcibly united in the period 1990 to 1994, has a Shiite minority, although it's a kind of Shiism very different from that in Iran and Iraq, has a strong leftist tradition in Aden and labor tradition, has a strong Sunni fundamentalist traditions, Arab nationalist traditions. Yemen is a very diverse place and very difficult to encompass in simple generalizations, but it is also therefore worrisome because you could easily see a lot of small countries there 15 years from now rather than one big one. So that's the one place where I worry about a Yugoslavia kind of collapse of the state into smaller polities. It's a very poor country, very few resources, running out of water. So each of these places is very different one from another. Egypt and Tunisia are not oil states. Jordan is not an oil state. Jordan and Egypt had very close relations with the United States. Tunisia, minor relations, much stronger with France. Libya is an oil state. And Bahrain is a minor oil state, does 40,000 barrels a day. But in some of these places, ethnic divisions have come to the fore. In others, they haven't been important. I think Egypt and Tunisia were primarily labor revolts. They were revolts of workers, both blue-collar and white-collar workers, and they were youth revolts because the youth supported the white-collar and the blue-collar workers. Because I think in both Tunisia and Egypt, the developmentalist state of the 1950s and 60s, in the post-colonial period, the state that had taken care of people, had taken over the unions, had built up the industry, had provided free education, the kind of nanny state, had, under the impact of neoliberalism in the 1990s and zeros, become a mafia state. That the state officers had taken advantage of their insider knowledge of economic decisions of the state to become billionaires and to make their cronies billionaires. And it was to the extent where they were interfering with other people's opportunities in life. And so then, since it was a narrow elite, if you could get rid of Zainuddin Ben Ali, you could get rid of 50% of the economic elite, which was related to him. If you could get rid of Mubarak, you could get rid of a lot of corrupt billionaires who were raining on everybody else's parade and getting in the way of their having a fair shot in life. So getting rid of one guy, is not that hard if you're really determined to do it as a nation and you're willing to take the risks of coming out into the crowds. Then it can be done. And really it's a kind of bargaining with the rest of the elite. It's saying, hey, you guys, you officers, you businessmen, you cabinet ministers, you've let this tiny faction batten upon the people like vampires. You need to turn against them and get rid of them, and then we'll all be better off. And that kind of bargain can be successfully made. And I think that's what happened. Finally, I'll just leave you with this. On January 1st of this year, I did a blog posting in which I laid out what I thought would be the major foreign policy challenges to the Obama administration in 2011. And if you'll just permit me, it's short. Number one challenge, my top 10 list. Egypt, after decades of being unproblematic for the U.S., may be on the verge of being a foreign policy challenge of some magnitude. President Hosni Mubarak is advanced in age and could pass from the scene soon. He is grooming his son, Gamal, to be his successor, but the WikiLeaks cables suggest that the powerful Egyptian military intelligence chief is not happy with this idea of dynastic succession. On the other hand, U.S. cables also suggest that the Egyptian military is declining in power and modernity. Although the government successfully repressed its radicals during the past 2 decades, they are back in the streets again with car bombings. More serious challenges come from the Muslim Brotherhood, which could do well in an election that was not rigged against them. Likewise, Egypt's labor and middle-class movements have shown themselves capable of mounting significant campaigns in recent years, deploying new communication tools such as Facebook. A more democratic Egypt, like a more democratic Turkey, may not be willing to be complicit with Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. Obama should not take Egypt for granted, but rather should have some subtle and culturally informed contingency plans if its politics abruptly opens up. Above all, the U.S. must not stand in the way of democratization, even if that means greater Muslim fundamentalist influence on the state. So, Scott, it's at least 2.